Welcome, everyone. We're going to let a few more people filter in. It looks like we have people that are logging on right now, but we will get started here shortly. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Stellick, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Doane University. Thank you for joining our webinar this evening. We already have over 100 people that have logged in, so we're pretty excited about that. Our goals here in the Alumni Office are always to educate, engage, and empower our alumni, students, employees, and friends. We're excited to have you join this incredibly timely webinar, which will be recorded and will be shared with the Doane community after we're done tonight. If you have any questions throughout, please go ahead and just type those into the question and answer box that's located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time throughout the presentation and definitely at the end to answer some of those questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Tonight's session will focus on the Ukrainian crisis, something which is absolutely on all of our minds right now. Our featured guest tonight is Dr. William Gleason. We're also pleased to have Marty Fye, Vice President of Advancement, and Tim Hill, Dr. Tim Hill, Professor of Political Science, with us to help facilitate this conversation. I'd like to briefly introduce you to Marty Fye, who I'll turn it over to in a bit. He is a 1983 grad from Doane. He currently serves as the Vice President of Advancement and also oversees admissions, enrollment, and marketing teams here at Doane. This webinar came together really quickly, thanks to Marty and a conversation he had with Dr. Gleason about the current events that are happening in Ukraine. And I thank him greatly for making this happen. Marty, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can introduce our other guests.
Thank you. So joining us is Dr. Timothy Hill. Tim serves as a professor of political science here at Doane. He received his bachelor's degree in political science and sociology from Furman University, and then he finished his master's and PhD at The Ohio State University. I want to make sure I put the in there, Tim. And Tim has taught courses at Doane since the fall of 2003, some of which include American government, political attitudes and behavior, political thought, religion and politics, and even a course titled Political Violence, What Makes Us Killers, to name a few. And the other individual I want to introduce to you is my dear friend, Dr. Bill Gleason. Dr. Gleason joined the Doane faculty in 1980 and served on the faculty until 1985 before teaching in the Ukraine from 95 to 2000, including 3 years as a senior Fulbright lecturer. Welcome, Bill. Welcome, Tim. We look forward to hearing the conversation. You can unmute and we'll get started. There you are, Bill.
Yeah, we're all set.
We're all set. Why don't we start just to kick this off, and I'll let Tim take it from here. But why don't you start off kind of a little bit about how you got to Doane, and then some your remembrances, just a few of those, and then kind of what happened when you left Doane, or why you left Doane. I think that'd be a great place to start.
All right, Marty. Thank you. Well, it's nice to be here. It's always nice to return to Doane and to see people along the way. And I wish, the only thing I wish was that the actual details of our meeting were not in place, because of course we're meeting to talk about the tragedy that is unfolding now in Eastern Europe, with a war going on between Russia and Ukraine. I came to Doane, as Marty said, in the fall of 1980, and I came here basically to teach Russian history in various ways. Doane was adding that position to the program. You know, I came here and interviewed, got a nice offer, decided this is where I wanted to be. So I stayed at Doane from 1980 to 1995. The only thing that really changed, and ultimately this would have an impact on my life, was that in 1991, and some of you may remember this, the Soviet Union collapsed and new countries emerged. You know, we had a total of 13 countries coming out of the Soviet Union, and one of those countries was Ukraine. So I decided, well, let's see if you can get some kind of support to go to Ukraine and do some reading and do some writing and do some teaching and so forth. And I was lucky to get a Fulbright, which is an international scholarship, in the fall of 1994-95. So I went off to Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, and I thought I'd be back at Doane in 1 year, because that's about how long the average Fulbright ran. Little did I expect what happened next to happen, but there we were. In September of 1995, the chair of the history department at the university in Kiev, where I was teaching, suggested that I stay an extra year to help them with their history program. Remember that there was no Ukraine as such prior to 1991, and so almost everything around the place was brand new. So I thought, well, this sounds like an interesting idea. And I gave the Fulbright people a call, and to my absolute surprise and amazement, they had an extra Fulbright lying around. And so they said, well, why don't you take it? Now, of course, I was, working at Doane, and I had, a year off from that work, but I called the university, the school here, Doane, and I called the Fulbright people in Washington, D.C., and they all agreed that I should have another Fulbright. So I took the second Fulbright. This was in the year 1996, 97. And then when I was there, and I'm in Ukraine, I hope this isn't too confusing, there in Kiev, the chair of the history department came along and said, we'd like you to stay and to become the director of the Ukrainian Fulbright program for all of Ukraine. So I thought, well, this is too much of an opportunity to pass up. So with reluctance, and a bit of sorrow, I resigned my position, at Doane and basically moved to Kiev, where I was from 1995 to 2000. In 2000, an offer came along from the State Department to have me become the coordinator of Eurasian Studies at the Foreign Service Institute, which is the training academy within the State Department that prepares our diplomats. And my particular responsibility was to work on the Ukrainian side and the Polish side and even the Russian side from time to time, although I stayed with Ukraine most of the time. So that's how I got to Ukraine, kind of around the back door, and through the windows and out the side door. I wasn't a trained Ukrainian specialist per se. I had to learn the new language. Ukrainian and Russian are somewhat similar, so it wasn't too hard for me because I already knew Russian. And that's how I got to Ukraine. And that's why I stayed in Ukraine. And from 2000 to 2015, I was the coordinator of Ukrainian studies within the State Department, which meant that I was responsible for the training of our diplomats to go off to Kiev. So I hope that that's clear. Don't worry, there's not going to be a test on this. I'll try to keep it under control. All right, now, maybe I should stop here and see if there are any questions at this point, or shall we go on?
Why don't we?
Okay. Let me say a few things about what's happening now. It is really hard, I think, for all of us in this field, in this area, probably even harder for the people who live in Europe, you know, right there next to Ukraine, right there next to Russia, to get their arms around this, because to tell you the truth, I think very few of us saw this coming. And by this, I mean a war where Russia would actually attack Ukraine. My question to you is, what's really going on here? I mean, what's really happening with Ukraine and Russia? I mean, why do we have a war in Europe, which is the first time now in 75 years that this has happened, where one European country has attacked another European country, you know, without being provoked to do so? To understand this a little bit, I think we have to remember a couple things. Number one, the leader of Russia, his name is Putin. I'm sure you know that, okay? He's the one behind all of this. And his hatred of Ukraine is rooted in the fact that Ukraine is making real progress, you know, or at least some progress, you know, in establishing a democracy for the country. In other words, they're bringing in, you know, young teachers, young scholars, and so forth, and they're really trying, you know, to become a better country, you know, and this is what frightens Putin, because Russia is a dictatorship and Putin is the dictator. And so his reasoning goes something like this: if the Ukrainians succeed in establishing a full-blown, viable, sustainable democracy, then there's a very good chance that the Russian people will either rise up against me or throw me out of office and so forth. And so I think the real reason for this war is the fact that Putin himself, you know, is frightened by the prospect of Ukraine becoming a democratic country. Now, of course, that might not happen, but at the moment, at least, we're stymied by the war itself. So when Putin declared, he didn't actually declare war on Ukraine. He hasn't even done that yet. He's used all kinds of excuses to rumble into Ukraine with his armies and everything else, you know, and to get control of Ukraine. Now, let me say just a couple things about the Ukrainian people. Ukraine has never been a full-blown country as such. You know, in other words, the Ukraine that exists today did not exist 20 years ago, did not exist 40 years ago. If you took a map out, you know, and put the map down and took a look at the map, you would not find a state of Ukraine. It was, but then in 1990, the Ukrainian people voted on whether or not they wanted to stay in the Soviet Union, okay? And the vote was overwhelmingly no, we want out. And this came as a great shock to Russian leaders, because they thought that the Soviet Union, of course, the Soviet Union itself was about ready to go out the door in 1990 and 1991, but they decided that this is time to go. So the Ukrainian state that now exists, you know, the full statehood of Ukraine did not exist before 1991. This is what I'm asking you to remember, you know, and everything looked fine up to that point. So Putin wasn't even on the scene very much until the end of the 1990s. In 1999, the Russian leader, Boris Yeltsin, some of you may remember him, okay? He was a kind of a decent leader, but unfortunately, like so many men in that part of the world, You know, he was a drinker and he collapsed on the stage of Johns Hopkins University once when he was over here giving a talk because he was dead drunk. So the Russian people decided to replace Boris Yeltsin with this new kid around the block. And most people thought, including yours truly, including me, that this young man by the name of Vladimir Putin could be controlled by the older people of Russia. Okay, by the way, this had happened in 1933 in Nazi Germany, the same line of thinking, but that's off the point. The point I'm trying to make is that Putin came to power at the end of the 1990s. In 1999, Putin stepped into office as the president of Russia, okay? Putin had already decided what he wanted to do, although he didn't tell too many people. What he wanted to do was to get Ukraine back. And the reason he wanted to get Ukraine back, the reason that Putin went after Ukraine, you know, after about 10 years, was because Ukraine is a very, very attractive land, a very attractive place. You know, it is wonderful for farming. You know, in fact, Ukraine had fed Europe. In the 19th century, Ukraine fed Europe. In the 20th century, Ukraine fed the Soviet Union. 95% of Soviet grain in the 1930s came from Ukraine. So controlling Ukraine meant a great deal to many Russians, including Mr. Putin, who was a demagogue, you know, and who was a dictator to begin with. So Putin started to look around for ways to control Ukraine. He started with Georgia in 2008. Georgia was a former republic of the Soviet Union. It's down in the Caucasus, okay? Not the other Georgia, this Georgia. So Putin kept going until it became clear that the only way that he could control Ukraine was to take it, literally seize Ukraine and try to do the best that he could. Now, most of us never really had, certainly I can speak for myself, you know, but most of us never had the idea that we're going to be able to stop Putin short of a major war. In fact, most of us felt that Putin was just going to kind of continue to play around the edges and not do much about Ukraine. So only about a year ago, and the reason for this, I think, is quite clear. In 2014, and I was in Ukraine when this happened. And in fact, I was not only in Ukraine, I was on the Maidan, which is the central square in downtown Kiev, and there were massive demonstrations by the Ukrainian people against the Ukrainian president, who was a real loser. His name was Yanukovych. And it got so bad, it got so much that eventually Yanukovych fled Ukraine, fled the country. Putin never forgave the Ukrainian people for getting rid of Yanukovych. And what Putin was really worried about, I think, was that this sooner or later, whatever happened to Yanukovych was going to happen to Putin. So my answer to the question, why did Putin go after Ukraine, can be answered by because he was afraid that the Ukrainian people were too open-minded, too democratic for him to put up with. That's the reason for this war. The reason for the war in Ukraine tonight, and a lot of people are going to be killed before tonight is over. There's going to be tremendous bloodshed tonight. I was watching a program, you know, on, I think, MSNBC before going over here, you know, tonight. And all of the panelists, all of the people on this program agreed that at least on a short-term basis, things do not look good for Ukraine because Russia is overwhelmingly superior to Ukraine in military strength and military size. So at least on a short-term basis, it's very difficult for me, and I haven't seen anybody yet who predicts that Ukraine itself is going to win this war or win this encounter. So to go back to my original point, question, why did the war happen? Why did the war break out? The answer, I think, is because Putin, and it's Putin himself, that's behind this. He's responsible. He's the responsible one. The Ukrainian, I mean, the Russian Duma or the Russian parliament didn't vote for this. This was all Putin, but he controls the government. Putin is a dictator who's got complete control over the government there in Moscow. So off we go to war, you know, 6 months, what? How long ago? 6 weeks ago? Maybe a little longer than that. I'm losing track of time, you know, here. Now, one more question, and then maybe we can get to some discussion here. Or Tim, maybe if you want to say something, fine, jump in here. Is there any chance, and this is the question that intrigues me because of what I saw on television earlier today, and I'll mention that in a minute. Is there any chance that the Russian people themselves might put a stop to this war? Probably not, at least in the short term, but tonight they had pictures on, I think it was MSNBC, one of the news cable stations, that showed thousands of Russians in downtown Moscow out parading around the streets. And what were they doing? They were protesting the war, you know, in Ukraine. They were protesting the war in Kiev. In other words, what they were saying was, there's no reason for this war. We have a lot of relatives and friends and people we know living in Ukraine, and that's true. You know, Russians and Ukrainians go back and forth between these two countries all the time. You know, Ukraine is very much like Russian. You know, they have the same culture, they have the same history, they have the same language, pretty much. So I think what these demonstrations were trying to tell us and tell the world was that maybe this war will end a lot faster and in different ways than we expected. I would be surprised, I'll be honest with you, I'll try to be as straight as I can here. I would be surprised if the Russians are able to stop Putin. I doubt that. You know, on the other hand, I'm not sure I predicted any of the rest of this stuff either. I didn't predict the war to begin with. I didn't see it coming. I can't remember a single analyst or a single commentator or a single so-called expert who did predict this war. So a lot is still on the table. Things could change in an instant. Things could really move quickly from one point to another, and nothing would surprise me, you know, at this point. So maybe we can have some discussions or questions.
Yeah, so it looks like there are a lot of good questions coming in the Q&A. Before we get to those, let me just do one more little bit of table setting here.
Sure.
So one of the things that was drilled into me in graduate school is that we have to answer the so what question, right? So let's do that right here at the beginning. Obviously, all the people on this Zoom call are interested in this and don't need this answer. But if they just go out into the world and they find people who are less concerned about the situation, say, what is the argument that a person living a quiet life in Nebraska should care about what's going on in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. Very good. Yeah, I had the same question myself, and I knew there was a question like this was going to be asked. I think it matters, Tim, because what Ukraine represents is a better life, a better society, a democracy, as opposed to Russia, which represents a throwback to an earlier age, to an earlier time, to a time of imperialism and dictatorship. And I think unless we want something like that, and we have an opportunity to prevent it or to put a stop to it, including a war in Central Europe, I think we should consider this.
Okay, so you mentioned a little earlier that that you suspected that Putin's real motivation for this was just controlling the region and keeping control of his own area. But of course, that's not what he has claimed is the motivation, right? And we have a couple of people in the Q&A who are asking some version of the question of whether Putin's complaints about his security concerns with respect to NATO being so close to his borders, or with respect to the possibility of Ukraine in some hazy future joining NATO, how much validity do you see those concerns having for Russia versus how much of this is just smoke?
Try that again, Tim. I kind of lost your voice there for an instant. Give me that question one more time. I'm sorry.
So Putin claims that this is about sort of legitimate security concerns, right? That's the reason of the buildup. And so I guess the question that I was seeing in the chat was, how much of that is real? Is there any legitimate concern that Russia would have in terms of NATO's expansion?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've asked that question to myself here several times in the last, remember, this war has only been going for 2 days. This hasn't been, this is the second night of the war tonight, okay? Now, the question is there any real threat to Russian security from Ukraine? I mean, and the answer is no. There was no threat prior to the war itself. The Ukrainians were not running around threatening to do something to Mr. Putin. In fact, Ukrainians had invited Putin to come down, the Ukrainian government, not the Ukrainian people, but the Ukrainian government not long ago, about 3 months ago, invited Putin to come down, make a state visit, talk to people about Russia's concerns. Of course, Putin turned them down because Putin was already planning a full-scale invasion, by that point. That became clear as time went along. But to try to answer this question or your question, I don't see any kind of real security concerns for Russia on this side of the line. I don't.
So going along with that, I'm currently teaching a class on conspiracy theory, and I know some of my students are listening into this. And it's interesting because Putin has explicitly justified the invasion in the speech he gave at the beginning of the invasion yesterday, or this morning, or whenever it was. He explicitly justified this by trafficking in some pretty wild conspiracy theories about Ukrainians committing genocide against the Russian minority there and calling the Ukrainian government Nazis. And I guess when I heard that, the thing that I wanted to know was, does Putin really believe that? And does he expect us to?
The answer to your first question is, I don't think so. I don't think he really believes it. I think he's making it up. But I'm going to say something else here in a second. Let me try to answer your other question. I don't think Putin expects other people to believe it either. What I'm beginning to see in Putin's behavior, and this is what we're really talking about as far as I'm concerned, the behavior of Putin, and more the behavior of Putin as I see it is that of a seriously mentally unbounded or mentally ill person. He gave a talk 2 days ago, to his council, to justify the shooting, the war in Ukraine. During that talk, he talked about the things you mentioned here. But it was interesting. He asked his ministers to stand up and tell him what to do. Well, of course, everyone knew what this is really all about. What this was really all about was everyone trying to cuddle up to Putin. Only one minister, Sergei Naryshkin. Naryshkin is Putin's age. They went through the KGB together when they were young men. Naryshkin had been in the KGB for 40 years. Naryshkin stood up and started to question Putin's motivation for the war with Ukraine, okay? To my amazement, Putin told him to sit down and shut up, essentially. And at that point, I started to think things that I hadn't thought of before. Putin lives pretty much alone. He lives by himself. Okay, he has almost no friends and contacts. And the question I'm asking here is, what does this mean for the rest of us? And the answer is, it might mean a great deal, because it tells me that Putin is not getting information of any real value, of any real kind, from anyone else, because people are afraid to tell him the truth. Okay, and if you're afraid to tell the person the truth, you're going to shut up. So these ministers who were all standing there with their heads down and bowed were doing just that, except Naryshkin, who was Putin's age, late 60s, who went through the KGB with Putin 40 years ago. and who knows Putin as well as anyone. And apparently Narishkin, check the name, Narishkin felt emboldened to tell Putin the truth. And look what Putin's response was. I don't think Putin is mentally stable. I don't think so. I can't prove that because, of course, that would mean something else altogether. I don't think Putin would want me to come up to him and give him a psychiatric test of some kind. But anyway.
Right. So people in the chat are asking about the way this may sort of unfold. So let's get into that a little bit. First of all, obviously the true invasion has started. There was a period there where I guess the White House was trying to decide whether to call what was happening an invasion or not, but now it's obvious, right?
Yes.
So what do you see happening over the next few weeks and months? Do the Ukrainians have any shot at defending themselves? Will there be an insurgency rising? What's going to happen over the next 6 months
really,
or so?
That's really a good point. It's a good question, and it's really hard to answer or even try to answer. I keep asking that question of myself here, all day long. What do you see coming? What's going to happen next? What are the possibilities here? Of course, again, as I said in my little talk here, from a military standpoint, strictly or alone, the Russians have the Ukrainians outnumbered by a lot. So if you simply go along that road, the chances are that Ukraine will be conquered. In other words, will be beaten up militarily and will have to settle for an occupation. Now, let me make one point here. Ukraine is a kind of a big country to begin with. It's about the size of France or about the size of Texas here. Ukraine has gone through a lot over the decades and over the years. Ukrainian history is full of violence. The Ukrainian people have shown a real willingness to try to fight, to maintain, their country, to maintain their opportunities. I think that regardless of unless something happens to Putin, I mean, you can turn this all the way around and say, well, maybe Putin will have a heart attack, or maybe someone will shoot him, or maybe someone next to him. It's not unimaginable, although it's highly unlikely. So the real question comes down to what is really possible at this point. What I think is really possible, Tim, or whoever is answering this question, asking this question, what I really expect to happen is I expect Ukraine to be defeated and occupied. But that's going to be a real big problem for Putin, because how do you occupy and maintain your control of a situation where you have a big country to begin with? You have over 40 million people who live there. That's a lot of people and a lot of places to control. So I don't think that Putin and the Russians will succeed very well in doing this, occupying, which means that the scenes of the people of Moscow out on the streets tonight protesting this war makes the occupation even more difficult. This is not like some other place where the people might accept what is going on the battlefield, or even take pride in what's going on the battlefield. I don't think so. I think if the Russians win militarily, momentarily, over the next few weeks, few months, I think the problems for Mr. Putin, and the Russian government are just beginning.
Okay, so let's say, for the sake of argument, that this succeeds in some fashion. And I, without your same level of expertise on this, I concur that this looks like it's probably going to be more of a headache for Russia than Putin seems to think it is. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it succeeds. There are a lot of people in the chat who are asking what happens next. In other words, does Putin stop at Ukraine? Or I know that President Biden has announced that we'll probably be deploying forces to defend some of our NATO allies in the region. Are those countries really at risk now?
Yeah.
assuming that Ukraine falls in the next few weeks or months?
Yeah. Well, these are great questions, by the way. Yeah, I had the same question myself because I cannot, for the life of me, see. I mean, the quick answer, the fast answer, Tim, to this question is that I have no idea, what's going to happen next, because things have happened so fast up to this point that I think anyone who tries to tell you that he or she knows what's going to happen next is either making it up or flat out lying. We just don't know. I mean, if in fact the military, if the war, if the fighting spills over into Poland, let's say, or into the Baltic states, into Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia, and that's a real possibility. I mean, how do you control all of these people running around? How do you control missiles, airplanes, submarines? You've got the whole shebang out there for the Russians, but the Ukrainians are well armed too, and they're well trained. They've received a lot of help from the West, particularly from the United States over the last 1, 2, or 3 years. So, but that doesn't mean that things couldn't go wrong, that something couldn't happen. In fact, that seems to be the lesson of wars anyway, that it's much easier to start a war than to stop a war. It's much easier to get going at the beginning, which is where we are now, than to step aside and try to bring things to a halt. So I have no idea, but this really raises what is, for me at least, the real question of the hour. And that is that if we are getting close to being in a situation like this, then Article 5 of NATO says that an attack on one NATO country is the same as an attack on all NATO countries. Imagine now, let's say that the Russian army somehow spills over into Poland or spills over into one of the Baltic states, or maybe Romania, states that are close to Russia. Maybe Putin decides to go for the whole shebang. Then what? Then what are we talking about? In my opinion, we're talking about the possibility of a nuclear war. Because Putin has referred to nuclear weapons increasingly so. In other words, he talks in these terms, he thinks in these terms, and I stop and ask myself, who is this man really?
Okay, so that's scary.
Okay.
So what then do we do? One of the questions I saw that I think maybe words this quite well is, if you were sitting in the Situation Room, what would be the advice you would give? And would that advice change if we were in the NATO Council instead?
What would I tell Putin?
What would you tell President Biden? And what would you tell the NATO allied commander?
Well, I think we have to, I think we have to make sure that our allies in Eastern Europe, and for that matter, and the rest of NATO too, have lots of weapons, the right kind of weapons. I mean, I don't think we can pull back on that. It looks to me like, Putin is certainly not pulling back on his use of weapons. I think that's one thing. I think we need to stay in touch with each other. I think that Biden is doing a reasonably good job, as our so-called commander-in-chief. In fact, I would say that Biden, up to this point, has done a very good job of keeping people together and keeping things together. NATO is in far better shape now than it was a year or two ago, because Trump, you will recall, wanted to break up NATO himself. He wanted to end NATO. And I asked myself, where would we be tonight, Tim, if we were sitting here with Trump? And the answer comes back, we would be in real trouble, I think. In fact, let me go off on a point here. Trump is the only person that I have heard so far praise Putin. You remember he said that he thought Putin was a genius. This was the other day, like 2 days ago. I mean,
Right.
the trouble with this war is that events are moving so fast that it's hard to keep track of time. But all I'm saying is that I think Biden has stayed on top of this. He has kept people together. NATO is in better shape now than it has been for a long time. Okay, if Putin decides to do something else, I think we're in a position where we can face that when it comes.
So I want to get back to the former president's remarks here in just a second, maybe. But I do think it's worth asking, and lots of people are interested in this as well. So far, the only thing that the United States and our allies have done is to impose sanctions. Is that because that's the only tool we have? Is it a tool that is likely to have any kind of an impact on Putin's behavior? Or I'm not going to say, should we look at ratcheting up, because I'm not particularly excited about the prospect of going to war with Russia, but is there anything that could stop Putin short of a united military response?
Yeah, great question, great comment. Again, I've had this question myself. I remember having a conversation, and I don't even remember who I was talking to at the time. I've talked to so many people in the last 24 hours, in the last 48 hours, and that's what we were talking about. This other individual said that he thought that the best approach at the moment to Putin and trying to deal with Putin was to go after the people around him and to, in other words, to make life very difficult for these people who sit next to Putin. And basically, I mean, most of them are oligarchs. They're incredibly wealthy people who have managed over the years to steal as much as they can from the state, from the government, from the treasury. Think of Russia as a kleptocracy. In fact, Russia is a kleptocracy. This is a government that steals from its own citizens. It steals from its own people. In fact, I don't know, I haven't read this anywhere or seen this anywhere, but I seem to recall someone saying not so long ago to me that Putin may be the richest man in the world because of the kleptocracy. Well, I don't care if he's the richest man in the world or the third richest man in the world. He's got a lot of money, and he could probably use that to buy off a lot of people. But we can go into London, into New York, into Paris, take their properties, seize their land that the oligarchs have, throw them out of the schools and universities that the kids are in right now. And another thing we can do is take all of the ambassadors from Russia to some other place, take them and remove them from power. That's it. Stop them. I can't think of anything else right now short of a military, approach. In other words, the only alternative that I can see to this, to what I just said, is a military one. And that could be horrific. And I think Putin knows that, by the way. He may be thinking just the opposite, that this is his only way of really staying in power. When I saw those pictures of the tens of thousands of demonstrators on the main square in Moscow, downtown Moscow tonight, I saw this just before coming over here, just before coming to meet you. I couldn't. I'm not coming to meet you, but coming around the corner to sit down with my PC here. I saw this picture. I mean, the number of demonstrators in Moscow tonight was huge. There were tens of thousands of people. These are Russian demonstrators.
So let's talk about the response from America and from the West. One of our attendees asked if European nations are going to stick with the sanctions once their oil prices start to rise. And I guess I would simply add to that, will Americans want to stick with the sanctions once the oil prices start to rise, once inflation becomes even more of a problem than it already is? Or will this become a political problem for Western leaders before it is a political problem for Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, no. Well, again, a great question. I have the same question. Will the American people be willing to pay the price, for really trying to put a stop to Putin? because it's going to mean higher oil prices, higher energy prices. There's no question in my mind that this raises a big question about the willingness of the American people. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why I'm glad we're here tonight. I think the average American person needs to sit down with himself or herself tonight or tomorrow or next week or next month and say, look, this is an important matter, the existence of a democracy, in a part of the world that hasn't known a lot of democracy over the years. Certainly not. I don't know what the outcome of that vote would be. So far, our legislature, our politicians appear to be going along with Biden. I mean, there are exceptions, not many, but for the most part, even conservatives like Ted Cruz of Texas, have gone along with Biden, and in other words, in dealing directly with Putin and directly with Russia. So again, Tim, your guess is as good as mine. It really is.
Speaking of, well, I don't know about guesses, but in terms of hearing things on the ground, do you still have, one of our attendees wants to know, do you still have friends in Ukraine? Are you in touch with them? I guess the first question is, are they okay? And the second thing is what are they telling you about what it's like there?
Well, I'm glad you finally asked that. I'm glad you asked that program. Actually, I was going to lead off the little talk tonight with a reference to my friends, in Ukraine. As I told you earlier, I taught for 5 years there at a local university in Kiev. It was a great school, a good school. And I'm getting emails now from my former students at that university. I got 3 emails today from former students. Of course, they would now be in their 40s, but when I had them, they were, 19, 20, 21 years old. And Tim, they all basically said the same thing. We're here, we're going to survive. And if we have to, we'll fight. They all said the same thing. We'll fight. Without exception. I mean, I was really taken back by that. I've got some former colleagues too from this university, people I taught alongside, for 5 years there. The name of the school, by the way, is Kiev Mohila. Mohila was the name of the 17th century priest who founded a university based on Western principles, because the Orthodox Church was falling apart in Kiev, and Mohila, who was the name of the priest, decided that they needed a better school, a better university. In order to get into this university, you have to speak perfect English, and you cannot speak any Russian at all. You can speak Ukrainian, and you can speak English, but you can't speak Russian. So I was amazed. When I would go into class, and you'll laugh at this, I would go into class sometimes, and just for the hell of it, start talking in Ukrainian or Russian, because I speak both languages. And the students would practically throw me out of the class, because all they wanted to hear was English. That was their lifeblood. Of course, this is happening. It's interesting to me. I heard somewhere, I can't remember which station it was or which program it was yesterday, that the Ukrainian language has never been more popular now than it is in Ukraine right now. In other words, more and more people, because let's remember that both Russian and Ukrainian are Ukrainian languages. In other words, people speak both languages to each other. You'll see couples walking down the street, maybe married couples, maybe boyfriend, girlfriend. One is speaking Ukrainian, one is speaking Russian, one is speaking English. I mean, it's kind of a language feast. So, I really think, and this is really, I don't want to sound too ridiculous here, it really caused me to tear up today when I saw scenes of the situation in Kiev tonight, because the Russians quite likely will attack at night, as they began a day ago. And then, I mean, there are over 2.5, 3 million people living in Kiev. This is a huge city, and it could easily be devastated by the time the night is over.
Speaking of things that are sort of in the path or have been taken, there are a number of people asking about the reports that the Russians have taken Chernobyl, and,
Yes.
and what that means. We all remember what Chernobyl represented in the 80s, and the area is still, of course, hot with radiation. So is there anything in particular that is notable or dangerous about the Russians being in that area?
Yeah, I can't answer that question because I just don't know. I'd have to find someone who did, but I'm frightened by the fact, frightened is the right word, I think. I'm frightened by the fact that the Russians now control the nuclear generator, the one that exploded, in 1986. This is really a scary possibility because, if the radiation gets out again, we're talking about Chernobyl is only 65 miles up the road from Kiev, from downtown Kiev. It's very close. And the only reason there wasn't, this goes way back to 1986, the only reason that real damage wasn't done was that on this particular day, on the day of the explosion, the wind was blowing in the opposite direction from Kiev, from downtown Kiev, and the numbers of people who were actually radiated was comparatively small. If that is not the case, I'm not sure that the Russians can do much about it. Now, Chernobyl is theirs. They own it. It's theirs. I don't know what's going to happen next, but it really scares me because if there's one thing, and maybe you know this from your own work and your own reading, if there was one thing that began the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, it was Chernobyl. And the fact that Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, did not tell the Russian people what had happened until a week later. And the only reason he said anything, then was that because the Swedes and the Finns and the Danes, who are to the west of Chernobyl, started complaining and started to make a fuss. So Gorbachev was forced to say something. I wonder who's going to say something now.
Well, so obviously that was a major mistake, and I'm wondering about the mistakes on the part of the United States that led to this point. If we think about the time since the Orange Revolution in 2005 or so, or even back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, what are the moves that the United States has made in the intervening 30 years there, which now play as missteps in your mind? Are there things that we should have done or things that we should have not done that would have made the present moment less likely?
Boy, you're asking a tough question here. I think the United States has done pretty well with Ukraine. I was part of that, actually. To be in the Fulbright program. The Fulbright program, as you know, is a special kind of fellowship because people go both ways with the Fulbright. The Fulbright program goes east and it goes west. I think it was one of the best programs that we had because we had several hundred students each year going back and forth across the way. And I just wish that we had more. Of course, now that's probably an impossibility. I think we did a fairly decent job in terms of, trade, in terms of fellowship opportunities, travel opportunities. I don't see how we might have acted differently with any kind of different result. I really don't.
Across that time, has there mostly been continuity in the approach that administrations have taken, or have there been some presidents that have handled the relationships involved better than others?
Well, I think George Bush was good. He seemed to have a pretty good understanding of international relations. Barack Obama didn't pay much attention to Ukraine. I'm not sure why. He didn't try to do anything. It's not like he was opposed to Ukraine. He just wasn't interested, at the time because of where he was. Trump is another story. Trump would just as soon that Ukraine be gone. Trump was opposed to other things we were trying to do. And of course, it was his run-in with the Ukrainian president, the current President Zelensky, that got him in trouble with our own Congress and led to his second impeachment, Trump. Okay, so there we have a real turnaround. I don't know what else to say. I don't think we could have done much differently at that point. I think we're acting very well now. I can't overemphasize that, Tim. You know, as far as I'm concerned, you know, Biden has done the right thing, you know, by bringing NATO together, by parking it on Russia's doorstep, which is where it is. You know, I mean, there are more American soldiers now, you know, along the line opposite Russia, you know, there with NATO than ever before. And the NATO minister, I mean, I was really taken back the other day when the German the German Chancellor, Schultz, I think he's the new chancellor. The old one, Angela Merkel, is gone now. But he decided to cut off the pipeline, you know, with Russia, the R2 pipeline with Russia, which of course is a tremendous blow to Putin. That's the real slap in the face, you know, as far as the West is concerned.
So let me ask one last question from the chat, and then I think I've got one thing that'll sort of bring us in for a landing here. We're getting close on time, but there are a number of people who are asking about where China fits into all of this, and I think that's a thing that we shouldn't ignore. First of all, I guess in terms of what will China's influence do to this immediate situation, and then also, if Russia succeeds in any measure, will China feel emboldened in ways such as, you know, maybe making overtures towards Taiwan?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, they're all good questions. I've asked that questions a lot, you know, over the last few hours. I don't know what China is going to do. I thought they might come down on the side of the West, you know, here, even though they've got a problem with Taiwan, you know, which is the offshore island that the Chinese claim is still theirs. You know, if that stays, if we stay the way we are now with China, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I simply can't get my arms. I'm a little surprised, Tim. I'm a little surprised that we haven't managed to talk the Chinese into coming over on our side because, and this is something you may know or you may not know, China has got a huge investment in Ukraine. The Chinese are buying all kinds of Ukrainian food, Ukraine is a rich country agriculturally. It's one of the richest countries in the world. The Chinese need this food. The Chinese need this. They need access to the land that is Ukraine. If the Chinese don't have that access, they're in trouble because there are very few countries in the world that can compare with that. When I lived in Ukraine, I was always traveling around the country on a train. I refused to fly because the airplanes were too dangerous. But I was amazed at the quality of the land, at the so-called black earth, as they called it then, the Chornaya Zemlya, or that's black earth in Russian. So I was always amazed, you know, at what I saw of the land. In fact, I even had a farmer come up. I was on the train going down to Odessa to give a talk on the Fulbright program at one of the local universities. And while I was standing on the train, this farmer walked up to, or this man walked up to me, and he had cowboy boots on, and he said, "Look at that window out there." He said, "I've never seen land this great." And it turned out that he was from Nebraska. There we go.
That's great. Well, before we let you go, let me ask you to peer into your crystal ball a little bit and just think about what might happen. This is kind of where we started, but if you could think about what is the optimistic scenario, plausible optimistic scenario for maybe 6 months or a year from now, what is the most pessimistic plausible scenario, and maybe what's the realistic thing that's in between those two?
Boy, that's a big question. The most optimistic scenario that I could give you right now would be the overthrow of Putin somehow, getting rid of Putin, get him out of there. You know, he's the problem. He's the one who's calling the shots here for this. This is Putin's war. This is Putin's war. And it's no one else's war. He's the only one who counts. So let's go after him and somehow deal with him. I don't know what that somehow is, you know, but get him out of the way. That would be my optimistic scenario. My pessimistic scenario would be an all-out nuclear war, or something resembling that because of the Baltic states and Poland. The person inside of me who's down the middle, I guess, if I had to guess, now the key question here, the key point that I'm making are the words have to. If I have to guess, which you're making me do, I would say that someone will take care of Putin. I don't think he has a lot of time left. He looked terrible to me the other day when he made that talk in his council meeting. He just looked awful. I mean, he was worn, he was wan, he had trouble speaking, he kept slamming the table with his fist. To me, Putin is mentally unbalanced, or he's mentally off, or something is very basically wrong, with him. So when I say that my optimistic scenario includes or is the removal of Putin, I guess I have to point to that.
And you think if Putin were gone, that Russia would sort of reverse course?
Yes, I do. After seeing the protest tonight, again a few hours ago, these were a lot of people. I mean, there was a tremendous crowd in downtown Moscow. We're not talking about 10 people out on a street corner somewhere having a little meeting or something. These were people who were, and this war is only a day and a half old. I mean, this war has hardly begun, and people are already in the streets protesting it. I think this is a wonderful sign. I think this is one. Of course, I realize they're taking a chance to, because Putin doesn't deal very nicely with these people. I feel sorry for Narishkin in particular. The Russian protester who's now in jail. I don't know what's going to happen with him. Putin's liable to take it out on him. That wouldn't surprise me.
Well, we can only hope that this ends with as small loss of life as possible. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Tim. Good questions. It's nice to talk. Nice to talk with you. Great.
I want to take a moment to thank both. Tim, thank you so much. You added so much to this conversation. And my friend Bill, thank you for taking the time. We had over 135 people who've joined this event that I'm sure we might, if you're up for another round, we might be able to schedule another round in a week or two. But I think that this is a statement of two things. One is Tim, the fantastic job you did working the Q&A and pulling those things together, because I think we got almost every question out there. But you had many friends like Dr. Muckle and Ned McPartland and some of your old peers that joined and wanted to make a greeting, and lots of students that have joined it, former students of yours, Bill, that joined this call. And I just want to thank you for, one, sharing your knowledge, and two, Doane provides a personal education, and you provided that for a number of folks in the 15 years you were here. And this statement of the number of people who joined is a statement of the quality of education that you provided and their interest in your knowledge. And Tim, the ability you had to drag all those out of him. So I certainly could not have done that in an expert way in which you did. So I want to thank you personally, Tim, and I want to thank you, Bill, for making this a great evening for all of us.
Well, thank you, Marty. It was nice to be here. It's nice to see you. It's nice to meet Tim. That was great. I'd be happy to do something like this again. Maybe I'll be a little less nervous the next time, or I'll be able to find the mute button on my I don't know. No, probably not. Probably not. I better not get carried away with myself here. But thank you, for a nice evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Yeah. Okay. Take care.